Hello and welcome to this tutorial on reviewing in NLP. My name is Margot, and on behalf of the whole team, I would like to welcome you. So while I present this introduction, we all worked on this together, and by we, I mean Kevin, Karen, myself, and Aurélie. We will each present part of this tutorial, and we will of course be there for the live session, all of us, to answer your questions. So to get you a bit into the idea behind this whole tutorial, or what brought us here, and what hopefully brought you here, is this. So you have probably experienced this. You get an email after you send a paper out to some conference, and you get back saying, "Dear author, we're sorry to inform you that your paper has not been accepted for publication at ACL 2020, for example." Now this already is quite a bummer, and puts your motivation down a bit. But then you go into the reviews and you hope to get some feedback on how to improve things or what went wrong and how you can make it better next time. And then you look at that review and you see something like this. This is a bad paper and should not be published. Please be aware that while some of the quotes that I'm mentioning now are from our own experience, so reviews that we received, some of them are also taken from Anna Rogers' blog here, where she collected other voices from the community about reviews that the persons received. Some other comment you might have seen was the main weakness of the paper is the results do not beat state-of-the-art models, which might or might not have been the whole point of the paper, but nevertheless, it doesn't help you to improve things. Or there's nothing really new about this paper, or this paper presents yet another question answering test. Variations on a theme, still not really helpful in improving your work. The paper is mostly a description of the corpus and its collection and contains little scientific contribution. Well, part of our work is about corpora and doing scientific work based on corpora. So it might have merit, but apparently this reviewer did not see it. I personally do not care for this topic. Boofed. Also a comment that doesn't help you at all in improving your work, improving your paper, in getting better. This must be the work of an inexperienced student. Okay, not only is this not helpful, it's actually pretty rude to state that, because maybe or probably you're not an inexperienced student. Maybe it might have been your first paper, but nevertheless, this is not a way to react. Not so good English. For most of us, English is not the native language, so we do make mistakes. But in just telling us it's not good, doesn't help us to get better. And maybe we want to get better. That's what reviewing is partially about, at least in my opinion. So you look at all these reviews and you think, oh, this is so bad. I don't want to hear that. And it doesn't help you. It doesn't give you any feedback whatsoever on how to improve things. It doesn't give you any notion about what actually went wrong, especially if it's a very subjective comment, like I don't care for this topic. Well, then it might still be valuable, but it's just that this one reviewer did not like the topic. So there is something wrong about the reviewing procedure or the reviews that you get or you might get. If you haven't received any of those as of now, consider yourself lucky. So that there is a problem with the reviewing process was part of a survey carried out in 2019 and presented during the ACL 2019 conference. And those results included things like reviewer preparation, review quality, but also reviewing load. Things that were mentioned was that a structured review form improves the quality and the clarity, and also forcing reviewers to say something positive and something negative about a paper provides a more balanced feel. So you get at least some positive out of the reviews and you think, okay, at least something good was done in your paper. It can help reduce bias and increase fairness in judgments. We will talk about that in the later part of this tutorial. And structures forms are very helpful, especially for new reviewers. Other parts of this survey were that they looked at the people that answered the survey. And they also asked how often people had reviewed. And you see that about half have reviewed 6 times or more, but the other half was below 6 times. But even experienced reviewers, and by experienced means 6 times or more having done reviews, might not have received any training or very little training. So they work just, by gut feeling. But there's quite a proportion of people who have never reviewed or just reviewed once or twice and who might feel insecure about doing reviews, how to do reviews, what a good way to approach reviews might be. And I'm stressing here that a good way, because we by no means want to say that what we are presenting here in this tutorial is the only way to do reviews, but it's one way of looking at reviews. And we're looking forward to a discussion during the live session about what other things one could take into account when doing reviews. One other issue that was raised during the survey was that reviewer quality is a major concern and training for new reviewers might be useful. So there is also a problem with the quality. And while during the session where the results were presented and there was a panel discussion, a lot was discussed about the review load, how to distribute submissions to make the reviewing a bit more bearable. This was hardly discussed during this panel discussion. And that's why we are here, to try to tackle the quality of reviewing and give you some ideas on how to improve the quality of your reviews. Thank you.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Reviewing in NLP tutorial part 2. I am Karen Ford. I'm Associate Professor at Sorbonne University in Paris, and I will present this part, that's the actual review part. So who am I? I'm specializing in language resources in NLP and also ethics in NLP. And my reviewing approach is basically write it the way you like to read it for yourself, and it's already a big deal, in fact. Like everybody else, I'm biased, especially as I'm a specialist in manual annotation. I tend to focus too much on the subject. This is the usual, if you hammer, everything looks like a nail. I also have a strong preference for well-written papers, and that's not a beauty pageant, Some papers are badly written or not so well written, and they are good papers anyway, so that's a bad bias I have here. Okay, so now, where are we? You've been through the introduction and background parts with Margot Miskes. This is the part 1 of the tutorial, and I'm doing now the actual review part. So what I'm going to talk about, well, first a couple of things we learned, and probably that you should know about reviewing. We'll go through review forms and related subjects, and then, well, a couple of other things, you'll see that. So, what you should know about reviewing. Well, this is a very nice comic by the PhD Comics website. If you don't know them, have a look. You'll have a lot of fun. And it basically tells you about the sub-reviewing chain in reviewing. So that's not what I'm going to talk about here, although it's a subject in itself. I'm going to talk about the last part. The part, is it good? Because yes, it's not so easy to know what is a good review or a bad review. But let's have a look at that. So straight to practice, I'll ask you now to review the reviews we've made. So we provided you with reviews. There are fake reviews, we designed for this tutorial. for the paper 42. That's the paper we're going to use in this tutorial. So you should read them and then ask yourself if they are good or bad reviews and why. And then we'll discuss them live on July 5th. So I'll give you a couple of answers just right now so that we can continue with the tutorial and you don't feel frustrated if you cannot attend on July 5th. But I hope the discussion will be more into details during the live session. So now press pause, read the reviews, write you think they are bad, good, and come back. See you soon. So back from the exercise. So what did you think? What do you think? Sorry. What about, have you spotted some bad reviews? I can tell you that at least 2 of them are bad reviews. That's review 1 and review 3. Why? Well, review 1 is pretty obvious, I think, because it's really freestyle, completely inadequate, with a rude reviewer. Plus it's incoherent, and that's really bad. So this review 1 is really not the kind of review you will like to see you write after this tutorial. Review 3 is also a bad review for a very different reason, because it focuses on a narrow point in the paper, namely the neural methods, and it's missing the whole picture. So that's also a bad review. Then what about review 2 and review 4? Well, they are all covering a lot of points, providing constructive, actionable feedback that we like to have at ACL conferences. And review 4 doesn't cover all the aspects of the paper, but it still is a good review. So this is just to make you touch upon what can be expected as a reviewer. So what makes a good review? Well, it's more difficult to say than to say what makes a bad review. So I'll focus on what makes a bad review. You've seen with Margot, there are two types of audience your review is aimed at. First, the authors, and second, the area chairs or the editors. So from the author's point of view, what makes a bad review? Well, a review with a superficial reading of the paper. Obviously, everybody is really annoyed at that kind of reviews. Also, obviously, rude reviews, nasty reviews like review 1. This is there are more complex types of bad reviews, and especially young reviewers tend to do that. They tend to be inflexible and to expect perfection. So it's not so good, because no paper is perfect. Even very good, very famous papers are not perfect. And also, well, keep an open mind, because it's not exactly the kind of structure of papers, or maybe there's something missing, but that's not so important. Don't be inflexible. If the main point is valid, interesting, making progress, opening new doors, please don't reject the paper. Even more complex, and that's the kind of mistake I used to make, now I'm trying not to make anymore, is reviewing your version of the paper rather than the submitted paper itself. What does it mean? It means that you're focusing on your interest in the topic, your feeling about the paper, rather than about the paper itself. And it's difficult to spot when you reach that kind of bias, because it really is a bias. So what you can do to avoid that, and that's what I try to do, is to reread the paper. If you, let's say you're reading the paper and you suddenly get angry at it, it means that there are feelings around it. There's something that's not completely scientific there. So just take a deep breath and try to reread the paper and try to find something positive about it. And it really helps, in fact. It helps you step back and see the paper with a different point of view. And that's very important, not to put your view of the paper on the paper. It will blind you, okay? So try to focus on what's important, the paper itself. And something that's not really related is you can also make unsupported claims about the paper. Try to avoid that. Things like there are missing references, and not saying which references doesn't really help, does it? So these are a couple of examples or types of bad reviews. I extracted them from the sources you see below, the last-minute reviewing advice blog post from the ACL 2017. It's really great. Have a look there. There are good reviewers giving you advice on how to review. That's very important. And also the mistakes reviewers make blog post, which is very good, very interesting. So now, from the area chair's point of view, it's not exactly the same point of view. When you're in an area chair, you're in charge of the whole area, let's say syntax or discourse or language resources. And then you have a number of reviewers working and you have to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And well, what you really hate when you're doing that, so I've done that 2 years in a row, including as a senior area chair. And what you really don't want to have is first late reviews, especially without advance warning and planning. I mean, if we know that you'll be late, it's okay, we can manage. But if we don't, it becomes a nightmare, especially if you don't answer emails. What we also don't like is a lukewarm review. A review that's not taking a stand, a review saying, well, I don't really know. Well, you should know. Take a stand. Say what you think about the paper. Should we accept it or should we not accept it? Also, incoherent reviews are the worst. It's because, for example, you have a positive review with low scores, and it's like, oh my God, what should I do with this paper? It's difficult to rate the paper and to rank it as an area chair when you see incoherent reviews or lukewarm reviews. Obviously, we don't want insulting reviews, and believe me, it happens. So please, please, please refrain and use the confidential comments to do the area chair if you pissed by your paper, which happens, okay? Yes, I also added the sources here. I added here the reviewer code of conduct from Calling 2018, and that's also a precious source of information. Please have a look. So now, the real thing. I'm asking you to read paper 42. And why paper 42? Because when you have a paper to review, usually you don't have a title, you just have this number. So it's paper 42 here. And you should write a short review. Short, keep it short, because it's just an exercise for this tutorial. But basically try to do it, just that we can have an interesting discussion on July 5th. And well, give us your opinion about this paper. And yeah, I hope you'll have fun while reading it and writing the review. See you in a couple of secs. Okay, so hopefully you're done now. So what you should ask yourself when you're doing a review, reviewing a paper. The first one is really, did I take enough time to digest the paper? It means that if you only read it once and, doing your baking a cake or whatever, maybe you did not focus enough on the paper. Did you take enough time to write and review your review? Yeah, because reviews take time. I'm sorry to say that, but quality takes time. So you have to take enough time to write it, especially if you're not used to writing reviews or if the paper is difficult. Please take time. You can, by the way, you can ask to review less paper. That's important. We don't all agree on that point. I think Kevin Cohen thinks that it's better to take all the papers you are asked to review. And I'm saying no, it's better to take the papers you think you can review in the time you have. But anyway, take enough time to do it. Did you focus on the work? On the work, not on the persons, not on the subjects, not on the way it's written, but really the work itself. Did you make constructive comments? That's very important, very important. And did you make substantial enough comments? Meaning that, did you explain what you're saying? Did you ground your point of view? Did you mention the references you're related to? All this, it's very important that the review is not just criticism, and nothing provided. It's very important. Why? Because people need to learn how to write a good paper. And sometimes they don't have a senior researcher around them to help them doing that properly. And maybe they need your help. So you're also part of the pedagogical process to help people improve the way they write papers. So one part of this, and it really helped me improve my reviews, I think, is, did I mention something good about the paper? Sometimes there's nothing really good about the paper. It's rare. Usually there's always something you liked about it. Please say it. It's very important. You all know what it means to send a paper being rejected to a conference, and you feel like you're disappointed, obviously, and it's always nice to find something, at least one good remark about your paper. You say, okay, this part at least was good. What can I improve? Again, it's part of the pedagogical responsibility you have as a reviewer. Also, yes, you have to check if there's code or data provided. You have to check it. I'll go into more details about that later. Is there potential plagiarism, salami slicing issues? Well, I go about that later too, but it's part of your responsibility as a reviewer to check that. And yeah, it doesn't take that much time, you'll see that. And yes, it happens. Yes, it happens. So, and the main question I already told you, the main question I ask myself is, how would I feel about receiving such a review? And try to consider your fellow researchers as human beings, and try to put yourself in their shoes. How would you feel about receiving such a review and such a comment like, not so good English? Okay. So yes, this is, I think, the main thing to keep in mind. At least for me, it works. So how did you proceed? This is one possibility, okay? There are many other ways to see that, but as a reviewer, you have a paper to be read and reviewed. You read it, maybe you mark, you add notes on it on the PDF file, or maybe you print it and you then highlight it with a pencil, whatever. And then you end up with an annotated paper. Again, as you see, I'm a specialist in manual annotation, so I tend to see things in terms of annotation. But it really is, by the way. So once you've annotated the paper, you try to write the first draft or review. What kind of paper it is, a major point, minor points, you organize your notes, you go back and forth to the annotated paper and the review. This is very important. This back and forth loop is very important because you will not read the paper only once. You will read it a couple of times, and some parts, maybe you will read some parts even more times than just 2 or 3 times. It's okay. I mean, it's really okay that's an iterative process, and it's really okay to do it this way. So do not hesitate to pause, to read it, to annotate it, and then let it rest, and maybe start writing the review, reread it, start writing the review, and so on and so forth. But there's not one possible procedure. So that's when I add this little logo with the light bulb and the question mark, it means that there's discussion, okay? The discussion is possible, obviously. There's not one process. All the reviewers have their own process of writing the review and reading the paper, annotate the paper, or whatever. So yes, your process is good if it's your process and if you spend enough time on it. Okay, so yeah, we can discuss that during the live session, but there are many ways, and we don't agree, as Kevin, Margot, Aurélie, and I don't always agree on this. So it probably means that your personality influences the process, obviously. So yes, reading is annotating. Do not hesitate to use various colors. It helps, for like positive points, negative points, maybe I don't understand that or whatever. It really helps, and you spend less time if you try to categorize and annotate the papers. By the way, it would be great to be able to collect these annotations and use them for NLP tools, don't you think? So now a little bit more into details. That's why I put the little logo there. What type of paper are you reading? Is it a methods paper, an evaluation paper, a reproducibility paper, a resource paper, a position or a survey paper? It's not because you're used to see experiment method papers that you always have that to review. So it's very important to identify the paper type and use the appropriate evaluation criteria, because you don't evaluate a position paper the same way you evaluate a method paper. And people, especially young researchers, tend to focus a lot on one type of paper. So let's have a look on what you should focus on. So all these examples are taken from the paper types from Calling 2018 website. Have a look there. So the first one is the NLP engineering experiment paper. That's the one you're used to read, and it's quite, you're used to that. So I'll go quickly. Can you tell the research question? What's the hypothesis? How was it tested? Is the research technically sound and correct? Is there an error analysis? That's very important, by the way. We see too many papers with no error analysis, and that's so important. Is there a meaningful comparison to the literature, to baseline? So you're used to that, okay? I will not go into too many details. If you have questions, we'll go on them. We'll focus on them during the live on July 5th. Reproduction paper, that's more rare, okay? But we now have such papers, and it's very important for the domain that we have such papers. So you have to check the data and the code availability of the original research, but also of the reproduction research. So that's kind of very different from what you expect from other types of papers. Keep in mind that you also have to check the documentation availability of the data and the code. There should be a description of the specific reproduction obstacles. Can it be generalized? Is it informative? Is there any useful insight of this reproduction? And is there a meaningful comparison to the original experiments? That's really what you want to have. Also, keep in mind that there's this terminology issue between replicability and reproduction. So what's the difference? And there's this Kevin Cohen and Aurélie Neveol and other people paper at LREC about this terminological issue, and it's important. You replicate an experiment and you reproduce a result. Okay, so that's the basics of it. And you can have replication papers about replicating the experiment, not really reaching the same result. That's not what's important here. And you can have reproduction papers which focus on the results that are obtained. So it's a bit different, but both are very important for a domain in order to sort out what really is a state-of-the-art result. So here it is for reproduction papers. Now, resource papers. Well, obviously you have to know a little bit about how the resource was produced. That is the source material, maybe the license, the workforce that was used. How was the resource evaluated? What was the quality control procedure? Was there an inter-annotator agreement that was computed? Using which metrics? Which version of the metrics? For example, the kappa, there are two versions of kappa, and I'll leave you to that, but there's this great article by Arnstein and Poesio in 2008 that explains all that in detail. So please explain how you computed your inter-annotator agreement. So if it's not explained in the paper, you've got to tell them they should be more precise about it. Also, are metadata and accessibility detailed? Again, that's the licensing issue, but also the availability issue. How does it compare to existing resources? Obviously, that's the state of the art, the previous work section. So that's what we expect from a resource paper. Keep in mind that language resources are keep being central in NLP, and that there are areas in both in calling and StarACL conferences about resource papers. Survey papers. So they are less well known, but they are very, very interesting and very helpful. There's it's a category in computational linguistics, the journal, and it's very interesting. So first, does the survey address a specific question? Which one? Does the paper identify a reasonably focused area to survey? And so there should not be a survey like NLP survey, it's too wide, obviously. And does it cover all of the relevant literature? So that's, for example, if you take the Arnstein and Poesio article from 2008 about intercoder agreement metrics, it really is this way. So it covers the question, it identifies the area to survey and the relevant literature. And yes, then you've got to identify areas for future work. That's what you do in most cases, okay? Survey papers are not that common in conferences, but you'll still have them in, for example, journals and, yes, some conferences. So more generally, what you have to focus on when you're reading the paper and writing the review is, what is the subject of the paper? Sometimes it's not that easy, because people talk about the methodology they used and the resources they used and this one and this one, and it's sometimes difficult to focus on the main issue. What is it addressing? And that's like the problem with the review 3 that's provided with paper 42. It focuses on neural methods, whereas the subject of the paper is not about that. So you really have to think about it properly. What is the paper about? What do they use? do they use? Data, usually they do. What kind of methods, what kind of tools, what are the results, what are the claims? And more importantly, do results and claims match? Because sometimes, well, you see probably with Kevin about that, but sometimes they don't. And that makes for very, very bad papers and they should be rejected. So that's the general idea. Things look like they're easy to do, but it's not so easy. Beware of the traps. Then, what should you do? Some of us think you should write a summary first. And what is the use of a summary? It's for the authors to understand that the point of view, well, what you got out of their paper, how you understand their paper. Some of us, and I'm part of them, would rather write it last, because I need to write the review, read the paper a couple of times before being able to write a proper summary. But anyway, it's a compulsory step. You cannot write a review without writing a summary of the paper. And it's not because people don't know what they've wrote in their paper and they need you to summarize it for them. It's because they have to understand that what your vision of their paper is. And at least it helps you focus on the paper itself and hopefully not on your vision of the paper. So yes, we can discuss if it should be done first or last, but anyway, it should be done. Then you should check that are the hypotheses sound? Is the experimental setup suited to the problem? Is the evaluation sound? That part is really important because I've read a lot of papers with an evaluation part that's not really grounded. So beware of that. Is the problem well motivated? And what is the take-home message? Does it work? If it doesn't, why? Keep in mind that a negative research paper is really important. I mean, that's how research progresses makes, steps using the shoulders of the other. And sometimes it's important to know that something doesn't work, so you don't have to retest it. And also, what are the conclusions? Are they supported by the results? As I said, claims and results. Okay, now, writing the review. Yeah, follow the order of the paper when you write the review. It's easier for the authors to understand where you are when you're saying there's a problem in section blah blah. It's better to follow the order of the paper. You don't have to write it in the order of the paper, but then copy-paste your part so that it looks like it follows the order of the paper. List the strengths of the paper. It's very important. At least find one. There's always one. And, well, we talk about that. Maybe you can list weaknesses too, but it's not compulsory. Sometimes there are no real weakness, small ones, but not important ones. And list major and minor issues, but separate them. What I do is I put minor issues like typos or problems with English or whatever at the end of my review. But you can do it as you go. And more importantly, support your claims with appropriate references. You'd be surprised by the number of people who don't do that. It's very frustrating when you're an author and you receive a review without the appropriate references to help you. So we reached the break, and hopefully at your place it will be as luxuriant as it is here. And I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Bye. So we're back, and we'll talk now about, quite quickly, we'll talk about review forms. So obviously I will focus more on Star ACL review forms, especially I will take the example of this year's ACL review form. It doesn't mean that all the review forms are exactly that way, but they're really look-alike in many ways. So let's have a look. So in most conferences in our NLP domain, so that's the Star ACL conferences, Calling, LREC, Convent, SwissText, TLN, etc., They use the same basic type of form with numeric scores, free text forms, and confidential comments. That's the basic three parts in the review form, with different granularity in them and so on, but it's the basic part. So the numeric score are kind of summary of what you think, and the free text form is basically where you write the review itself. So practice. Here is a review form, a very, very tiny one, with a quantitative score, review of related literature 1, so that means that major relevant papers are missing, and the comments to the authors are the following. There are missing references. So what do you think about this fragment of a review? So, yes, there's an inconsistency issue here. Sorry, not an inconsistency issue, but you're saying there's a lack of references, there are major relevant papers missing, and you don't say which ones. And that really isn't a good review if you don't provide constructive comments, and that's not constructive to say there are missing references, and it's not actionable. So you got to provide the authors with at least the major references which you think are missing. Okay, and as an area chair, this is the kind of thing that we rejected. We asked the reviewers to go over their review and add missing references. So please, if you have them, put them in. It doesn't take too long. So yes, the numeric score should be consistent with your textual review. If you're saying, like here, if you put 1 in terms of related literature, that is a bad score, then you should not say there are all the papers, the state of the art is their previous work is okay, because it's not. So be consistent and check what you said. Does it correspond to the score you gave? And so on and so forth. Now, there's discussion. We can discuss that forever, but some people rather, you've got the possibility to do it, to write your review online or to write it offline. So some people prefer do it online, some people prefer do it offline. I like to do it online because it's easy to fill in. You've got these nice boxes when you can enter text and so on. The problem is then you have a limited session. And you might lose your scores or your text. And that happened to me a couple of times, but it takes time to recognize you're wrong. And as for the offline form, I think for me, they are not so easy to fill. They are in old school text format usually, and I'm not always sure where to put things. So I don't like them a lot. But at the same time, they are very convenient because there's no limit in time for you to fill them in. So, yeah, well, I don't know. And Aurélie has this mixed approach, which I think is really interesting. She writes a review in a text file, and then she copy-pastes them in the online form wherever it's needed. So yes, there's no perfect solution. Find yours, the one that you like most. Be aware of the limit. But also be aware of something I just added here. These review forms, they contain bias. They provoke bias. Here, for example, I will go into more details, but as they force you to look into some specific points, then you will focus on these specific points, and maybe it's not always good. So let's have a look at the ACL 2020 review form. The first question is, what is this paper about? What contribution does it make? What are the main strengths and weaknesses? And then you've got the reasons to accept and the reasons to reject. Then the overall recommendation. You get to say what you feel about this paper. Then the usual reviewer confidence. Do you think you're a specialist in the domain, more or less? The author response. the questions for the authors, the missing references, typos, styles, grammar, this is the minor points, and additional suggestion, and finally the confidential information to the researchers. So this kind of review form is kind of biased. When you think about it, they ask you what are the main strengths and weaknesses. So you tend to, when you see that, you tend to try and find weaknesses. And that's a problem, because maybe there's not, or they are minor. And that's the kind of review form we always have in the domain. In the bioinfo domain, they ask you the major and the minor points. And it's very different, because if you're asking for major and minor points, you're not asking to find and put a weakness. So it doesn't make you focus on weaknesses, which I think is a better way of seeing things. So keep in mind this point, okay? When you're filling in your review form, if the review form is asking you for weaknesses, try not to focus on them, okay? So confidential comments now. I'm coming back to this. When should you use confidential comments? So basically, when you have other comments concerning the overall recommendation, especially if you see and you know there are special circumstances that apply to this paper, and they might allow for acceptance despite lower marks. For example, it's a negative result paper, and it could be very interesting to have this kind of paper at this conference. And you can, obviously the area chair are responsible for choosing that, because it's more of a conference politics decision to make, but you can still tell them, despite the lower marks I put, it's very interesting because it's a negative paper, blah, blah, blah. That could be interesting. Also, comments about the authors. If you have comments about the authors, just put them here, if you know them, or if you manage to identify them. Obviously, plagiarism, salami slicing concerns should be put here, because it's not your responsibility to address that directly. Also, concerns about your own review. For example, your level of expertise. If you're not an expert in this domain, you should say it. And if you discovered a conflict of interest somewhere, somehow, for example, with another reviewer, just say it. Also, anonymity breaches, and this could be for you. Perhaps you have reviewed the same paper before. It happened to a couple of us. So you should say here. It doesn't necessarily mean you should not review the paper, but at least you have to tell the area chair of this problem. And anything else you think is important and should not be visible to the other reviews and the others, okay? It's you to say if you want to add a confidential comment. However, be sure that it's important and relevant. Do not flout the area chairs. They already have a lot of work on their plate with confidential comments. So now, a very, very good question. That's a discussion we should have together. What do we do with very bad papers? Yes, because there are such things as very bad papers. And something you should not waste your time on very bad papers. And other thing you should make a pedagogical effort. And I personally don't have the answer to that. I think it really is a question of your state of mind at that time when you're reviewing the paper. Do you have so many papers to review? And so that's your context. Make sure you're not insulting anyway. That's very important. Make sure you make constructive, actionable comments. But should you spend a lot of time on the paper? And it really depends if you feel like the authors made an effort. That's my point of view, okay? If you think the authors really didn't take enough time writing their papers, didn't make any effort, then probably you should not spend too much time on it, and stay polite, state that you think that it's not a paper relevant to these conferences for this conference for such and such reason, and don't spend too much time on it, especially if there are so many typos, grammar issues. If everything goes wrong, just focus on the main points and don't waste your time on it. So this really depends on, for me, it depends on the image you have of the others. Sometimes it's very good to make a pedagogical effort to spend a little bit more time on a bad paper, and hopefully to help the authors improve the way they write papers and the way they do research. But yes, it's always a question of time, so you've got to find a balance. So talking about balance, here's a break, and I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Bye. Okay, back to business. Now, yes, the what else part of my actual review presentation. Yeah, could not help it. Can you if you got the opportunity to put a picture of George Clooney on your presentation, why not putting it? So yes, what else? I'll here focus on a couple of issues, and like plagiarism. As a reviewer, you're supposed to check for plagiarism in the papers. So what is plagiarism? I took the Merriam-Webster definition. So it's to steal and pass off the ideas or words of another as one's own, or use another's production without crediting the source. So that's quite easy to describe. Sometimes it's not so easy to spot. But yeah, if you used to teach, if you used to check your students' work, it's probably obvious for you when you see plagiarism. It's not always obvious in papers, so please make an effort and check it. How can you do that? Well, let's have a look. Please reread paper 42, and you know it by heart now, and check if maybe there is plagiarism in it. And if you find plagiarism in it, find the source and tell me. I give you a couple of seconds to do that. Press pause, sorry. So yes, there's plagiarism in paper 42. I think it's in the end somewhere. And yes, the source can easily be found on the web. So how can you check that? Well, you could use your university's plagiarism detection software. Most universities have them now. At Sorbonne University, we have Compilatio, which is, well, fair enough. At the University of Amsterdam, they use iAuthenticate. I know that. Well, check with your university. It's always good to have a plagiarism detection software available. You could also write your own similarity detection systems. That's what we did a couple of years ago at ASEL, and it works nicely. You're an NLP person, so probably you're able to do that. You can also very simply use your favorite search engine, and you copy paste the part of the paper that you think it might be plagiar. To have a plagiar is good. For plagiarism, sometimes it happens that you find something that's called salami slicing. And it's not exactly self-plagiarism, it's close to it. So what salami slicing means? Well, salami publication, it's very funny, it's also called Bologna or trivial publication. Bologna, I like it, is the practice of dividing one significant piece of research into a number of small experiments to increase the number of publications. application. Paper on the evaluation part of your experiment, you publish a paper on the tool part of your experiment, and then you publish a paper on the language resource part of your experiment. And then maybe you publish a bigger paper with everything that's in it, and it's collecting all the things you've published separately. So that's salami slicing. Separately. To have a plagiarism is good. We could discuss that, but I think salami slicing is bad for research because you have to check more papers if you're looking for a result, if you want to know what's been done before, writing the related work section. Try to know what's been done so that you don't do it again. With salami slicing, you have so many more papers to check, and it's bad. It's bad for research because there are so many papers we have to check already. So sometimes it's not stated openly by the conference organizers that it's forbidden, but sometimes it is. And it's also your work as a reviewer to say, okay, it looks like salami slicing because I found a paper that's been published lately, and it looks like this one, except that it's focusing more on the evaluation part than the resources part, for example. What do you think? Because it's the chair's decision, okay? It's more of a political decision, an ethical decision, okay? But if you're looking for plagiarism, you may find salami slicing, so that's why I'm telling you about it. Self-plagiarism is another issue that's related. It's when you plagiarize yourself. It depends on the size of the self-plagiarism part. Sometimes you feel like you've written this 10,000 times already, but in fact it's new. And sometimes you feel like you've never written that, but it really looks like something you've already written. So it really is a question of the quantity of self-plagiarism. If it's like 2 sentences, well, it's perfectly okay. But if it's like 3 or 4 paragraphs, maybe you should ask the authors to rewrite this. Okay. So that's open for discussion, obviously. So research material in paper 42. Have you looked at it? I mean, there's research material that's they put a link in paper 42 to research material. Have you checked it? Is it available? Does it look relevant? I'll give you again a couple of seconds to have a look and come back with the answer. You can press pause in the meantime. So yes, there's material available in paper 42, and no, obviously it is not relevant. It has nothing to do with the paper whatsoever. And believe it or not, it happens a lot. So you really have to check this. You also have to check this because, yes, sometimes it breaks the anonymity. So you have to check if the data which is provided or linked to really exists, because sometimes it doesn't even exist. Is it related to the paper, obviously? And check if it does not break the anonymity, because sometimes people put a GitHub with their name on it, so too bad for the anonymity part. It doesn't mean the paper is bad, doesn't mean the research is bad. It means that you have to tell the area chairs there's a breach in the anonymity, because we know, and Aurélie will tell you more about it, there are biases related to people, are they senior or more junior, and institutions. What if you see that the paper has been, in fact, the material provided comes from Stanford University, and how does it compare to, I don't know, Nancy, France University? Okay, so check this, please. And if you have time, and if you're curious, and if you want to do it because you think it's important, try to download it and run it. I usually try to do so, and obviously it never works because it will take too much time to download all the related pieces of code you need to do something. But anyway, sometimes it does, and you're very happy. So yes, now a summary, writing a review. Well, you've heard that a couple of times from me. Plan enough time to do so. Writing a review takes time. Reading a paper takes time. So do not hesitate to say that you cannot review 7 papers, that you'd rather review properly 3 or 4 papers. Be polite. Yes, be polite. It's the basic. Focus on the work. Sometimes it's difficult, but yeah, try to do that. Avoid trivialities. Do not attack the authors. Take specifics into account. For example, if it's a paper related to low resource languages, well, maybe they didn't have millions of tokens to train their model. And maybe it's they use different technologies because they don't have a choice. So yes, take specifics into account when you review a paper. Be as elaborate and explicit as possible. Do not say things like missing references without putting references. And obviously, if you put bad scores, then you have to elaborate your review to support this. And yeah, to a certain point, because if the paper is so bad, maybe you don't want to spend so much time on it. It's a question of balance, and I'm sure you'll find it. So what's next? Well, the next part will be by Kevin Cohen. It's about reviewing a specific section. I think Kevin will focus on the conclusion. And then you'll have ethics and reviewing, which is very interesting. It's by Aurélie Névéol, and it's the part 4 of our presentation. Now the punchline. Thank you so much for your attendance and to follow my voice and the slides. Yes, obviously your feedback is welcome. You can attend the live session. I hope you will attend it on July 5th. Sorry, I'm tired. And well, anyway, do not hesitate to send us an email if you have questions and you cannot attend July 5th or you don't want to ask during the live session. Do not hesitate to send us an email. Please send the email to everybody because we really worked as a group, as a collective effort. So everybody will be happy to receive your feedback. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon in real life one day. Bye.
Hi, my name is Kevin Cohen. This is my coronavirus confinement haircut. This is my coronavirus confinement beard. And this video is a tutorial on how to review the conclusion section of a data science research paper. And I'll be focusing on machine learning and natural language processing. This tutorial was prepared with my colleagues Karen Faure, Aurélie Névéol, and Margot Miskas. So let's start by making clear what it is we're going to be talking about here. So we're talking about conclusion section, and at the same time, we're going to talk about conclusions. Well, when I talk about a conclusion section, I mean the last section of a paper. Sometimes it's called the conclusion section, sometimes it's called the discussion and conclusion section, and it typically has 3 parts, which you see on the left-hand side of your slide. So one of those parts is a review of the work that's been presented in the paper. What was the question? What were the methods used? What were the materials, the findings, and what those findings mean with respect to the question that was being asked? There's often a section on future work to be done, on limitations of the present work, on remaining open questions, something like that. And then there is a conclusion. What do I mean by a conclusion? It's a very ambiguous word in English. One meaning of it is the last part of something, and this is the last part of the paper. But the meanings that are more relevant here are a reasoned judgment, that would be a judgment about what the results mean with respect to the question being asked by the paper, or the necessary consequence of two or more propositions that are taken as premises. And so in that case, what that would mean here is that we have the premises that a question exists in the paper, that the materials and methods are appropriate to answering that question, and that the results do give you some kind of an answer, and then the conclusion would be what the consequence is of those premises. To find the conclusion in this sense in a paper, look for words like "we have shown that" or "we report," something like that. And the reason we're talking about conclusion sections at all in the context of a tutorial on reviewing is that conclusion sections are a nearly universal section of papers in our fields. It's quite unusual, actually, to read a paper in any area of data science, whether that be natural language processing or machine learning, what have you, that doesn't include a conclusion section. So here's a little exercise for how to answer the major question, the major question in evaluating the conclusion of a paper is this: is the conclusion in the sense of that statement that is implied by the premises, or that follows necessarily from the premises, is it supported by the methodology of the paper and then the outcomes of the experiments that were done? You might be wondering right now, that's a huge question, right? In some ways, everything we do to learn about how to be scientists is about learning to pose that question in our own papers and to answer that question when reading other papers. Can we do that without being experts in the field? Let's look at an example. So here's an exercise, and we're going to ask a simple yes or no question. Do the methodology, and the outcomes that are reported here support the conclusion. So on the left-hand side of your slide, you'll see the methodology and outcome reported in a paper. So the paper's methodology is to compare a machine learning classifier called a support vector machine with one kind of feature called a bag of words. And if you don't know what any of this means, that's going to be relevant. You'll see. So the paper compares that with an SVM classifier that has something called glove word embeddings and a bag of words as features. So case number one is one set of features called a bag of words. Case number two is a classifier with two sets of features, one of which is the bag of words and one of which is glove word embeddings. And then the outcome is that the SVM classifier with glove word embeddings as features outperforms the SVM classifier with only a bag of words as features. And then the conclusion of the paper is that deep learning is the best approach to classification tasks. So take a minute to think about it, pause your video while you do that, and I will go get a cup of coffee. So you've thought about this. What's the answer? It's probably fairly clear to you that no, in fact, the methodology and the outcome don't support the conclusion. How do we know that, even if we're not experts in the field? Because the paper compared two feature sets. One of those feature sets was partially produced by a neural network. That is the glove features. But the fact that this part of the feature set in that second condition was produced by a neural network, that doesn't tell us anything about neural networks per se. So given that the conclusion of the paper is that deep learning is the best approach to classification tasks, and that the paper didn't actually evaluate deep learning itself, says to us, no, the methodology and the outcomes don't actually support the conclusion. If you are an expert in the field, you might be thinking, well, it's had glove word embeddings. Well, and glove is a neural network technique, but the features are word embeddings. Where those came from, it's not relevant to what actually happened in the outcomes of the experiment, one way or the other. You could have gotten those word embeddings from word to vec. You could have calculated them by hand, right? That doesn't have anything to do with the actual experimental setup. And therefore, concluding from this that deep learning is the best approach to classification tasks, that's not valid. If you have questions about this, or if you just disagree with me, we'll cover them during the discussion section. Please bring your questions or disagreements ready to talk about them. So what do you do with your evaluation of the conclusion section? Obviously, you're going to talk about it in your written comments to the authors, but how do you score it? Well, it's usually your evaluation for this is usually scored as part of the acceptance or rejection recommendation. I say that because typically there isn't a specific review criterion like, do the methods and the outcome support the conclusion? When you don't have that specific review criterion, it's essentially subsumed by your overall acceptance recommendation. So if indeed the methods and the outcomes support the conclusion, you might recommend acceptance of that paper, assuming that it's significant and innovative and so on and so forth. If the methods and the outcome don't support the conclusion, you're probably going to recommend rejection for that paper. So we've talked a little bit about what the typical parts are of a conclusion section or a discussion and conclusion section. I'm going to repeat those here just for your reference. It's a little bit expanded from the way I talked about them in the previous slide. Just know that this is what you look for in a good conclusion section. So let's look at another exercise here. And again, we're going to ask a simple yes or no question. Do the methodology and the outcomes support the conclusion? So let's pause the video for a second. I will go clean up some cat vomit. And when you have an answer to the question, start the video again. Okay, cat vomit cleaned up. So let's talk about this now. So we have a specific pipeline that's applied to a publicly available data set. A single value is reported. That value is compared to previously reported scores, and the value is higher than the previously reported scores. Experimental details aren't really given, and there's no code available for this pipeline. The conclusion then is we have state-of-the-art performance on this data set. If you are far enough along in your career to be watching a video about reviewing conclusion section, you have probably read some form of this paper 1,000 times. Does the methodology and the outcome, do they support the conclusion? No. Why do I say that? Because the paper provides about as much detail as an advertisement for a product. Under-described methods, unavailable code, mean that the paper does not actually describe the methods. You have to ask then, is the outcome even valid? in the scientific sense? Does it answer the question that the paper is at least implicitly asking? Indeed, if you don't know what the methods are, and you don't know what the people did, you have some questions about the actual outcomes of the reported values, then a conclusion that we have state-of-the-art performance, it's not supported by the paper itself. Could be true. We don't know. If we don't know, we're probably not gonna accept that paper, right? So let me give you an extended exercise now. And again, we're gonna ask that simple question. Do the methods and the outcomes support the conclusion, or don't they? And what I'm gonna talk about here, rather than an abstract paper, is some work that I actually did myself pretty recently. So my task here is a completely novel document classification target. So we've all seen 1,000 document classification papers. This was, I was looking for a kind of paper that no one has ever tried to classify before. My data, I had 100 positive instances and I had 100 controls or negative instances. My methodology was quite straightforward. I had a bag of words and 3 classifiers, and I got a result of 0.85 F measure. 0.85 F measure, your first attempt with a bag of words, very simple feature set, wonderful, right? Does that support the conclusion that I have state-of-the-art performance on this task? Well, I'm the first one to ever do the task, right? Necessarily, any performance that I get is going to be the state-of-the-art, right? And my state-of-the-art was pretty good for a first attempt. 0.85, that's pretty publishable. Actually, though, the methodology here didn't actually do the task that was intended. Let me show you what I did. So I was trying to do a completely novel document classification task. And I told you about the methods. I told you a little bit about the data, but not everything. So my 100 positive instances were extracted from PDFs. The 100 controls were text that was taken out of PubMed Central XML. Now, it happens to be the case that if your data source is what's called PubMed Central XML, it's very clean. In contrast, if you extracted your data from PDFs, there's usually some noise in it. And indeed, what I turned out to be training on when I got that wonderful F measure with bag of words, it was artifacts that came out of the PDF extraction. So you got a PDF, you pull out some text from it, you get some artifact from that. And the signal that I was training on was actually the artifacts of the PDF extraction. So this is a classic case of what's called the confound. Confound means that there are 2 possible explanations for the outcome, and you just can't tell which of the 2 is the real one. Did I really do my document classification task? Did I just train on the PDF extraction errors? I don't know. I don't have a way to tell them apart. If I don't have a way to explain the outcome of the experiment, I can't conclude anything from it. Now, the reason I bring this up is that natural language processing research is rife with confounds. Rife with means that they're everywhere, including hidden away where you don't see them. It's like cockroaches in the kitchen of that apartment I had in college. Let me give you some examples of ways you can see that. So in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you're seeing you're seeing a section of a paper by Trishnig et al. On tokenization. And what they showed in that paper was that tokenization can actually have a bigger effect on system performance than the choice of an algorithm. Now, if you're writing a paper, if you're reviewing a paper on an algorithm and tokenization could explain the results as easy as the choice of algorithm, then you have and you can't tell the difference, you have a confound. It's not a paper you're going to accept. It's a wonderful paper. I think one of the most important of the past decade or so. In the lower left-hand corner of your slide, you see a paper that with a table that shows that the effect of balance on your performance can be quite large. That's a big enough difference in performance to make the difference between beating the state of the art and not. And again, if you don't know if the cause of your performance difference is the system that you built or the balance that you used on the data, it's not a paper that you're going to accept. Figure in the lower right-hand corner showing learning curves, comparing 5 systems where you see that with a small amount of data, there's a particular ordering from top to bottom of system performance, and that with more data, the ordering completely reverses. Again, this is a situation where somebody might be writing a paper about this system, but in truth, you don't know whether the ordering of the system performances is due to differences in the algorithms or just to the amount of training data. And the ordering might be completely different with another order. Again, another kind of confound where you don't know whether the cause of the performance differences is the algorithm or the amount of training data that was used in those particular experiments. And that's from a paper by Banco and Brill. It was the first natural language processing paper that rocked my world, and I strongly suggest that you read it. So we've talked a lot about a number of fairly specific contexts, and I want to give you some pointers to things that you could read to learn more about them. So when we talk about that question of whether or not the conclusion actually is relevant to the methodology that was answering a question, that is called spin when they don't match up. I'm giving you pointers to a number of papers here, most of them by Anna Koroleva and Patrick Darubek, on the question of spin and how to detect it with NLP. And then the last paper on there is a question about reviewers and how good they do or don't do at recognizing spin in papers. Here is some work on confounds in natural language processing, and some work on the question of what do results actually mean? And you'll see quite a few authors who have looked at this question in machine learning in general and in natural language processing in particular. So as we end this tutorial, I would like to remind you that this material was co-written with my colleagues Karen Faure, Margot Miskis, and Aurélie Neveol. And I'd like to wrap up with one final exercise for you. Here it is. Describe a paper such that the methodology and the outcomes support the conclusion. Now, this is hard. We all spend our entire careers trying to figure out how to write that paper. But it's worth doing. As the great sage Hillel put it, all the rest is commentary. Now go and study. Thanks for your attention and have a good pandemic.
Hello and welcome to this ACL tutorial on reviewing, prepared by Kevin Cohen, Karen Faure, Margot Miskes, and myself, Aurélie Neveu. So by now you have had an introduction and some background on the topic by Margot. You have gone over some do's and don'ts for tackling an actual review with Karen, and you have received some insights from Kevin about reviewing a specific section in a paper. So now we are starting part 4 of this tutorial, and I am going to talk to you about ethics and reviewing. First, I want to tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm Aurélie Neveu. I'm a researcher at CNRS, and I work on a multidisciplinary topic, namely biomedical natural language processing, which involves, of course, computer science and linguistics, but also medical informatics and the health domain at large. So coming from this background, I think it's very important to be open to a large variety of approaches to research problems. And as a reviewer, I see that you are actually given this opportunity to find out about your colleagues' research through the paper that you're going to be reading and reviewing. And yet I have found that sometimes I look at a paper thinking, why didn't they do it this way, like we do in the medical informatics community, or the way we do in the NLP community? And it can be difficult to not let these quirks cloud your reading of the entire paper. And so, for instance, coming from the medical informatics community, I know that one of my biases is that I'm really partial to papers that are structured with the classical introduction, method, results, and discussion structure, and using these exact titles for the sections. Also, coming from an applied science background, I also have a very strong interest in evaluation that goes beyond looking at specific performance measures, because when we talk to users of our systems, oftentimes they're going to say, okay, we want the system to be good enough for the task that we're interested in, but can the system also run with our architecture that is already in place so that we don't have to do too much work putting it into place and using it? Or can we understand where this particular prediction comes from, and so on. But so the point I'm trying to make here is that we all have biases, and they come into play when we are reviewing papers, and so we'll come back to that. But that's why I think it's important to approach reviewing with an open mind. So now let's get to the meat of what we want to talk about now, which is ethics in reviewing. So in the context of reviewing, the principles of ethics apply to everyone involved in the publishing process, and in particular to reviewers, but also authors. So reviewers have to provide fair, balanced, polite, ethical reviews. And on the other hand, authors have to do due diligence to carry out their research that they're describing in the paper. So they have to carry out this research in ethical ways. And the review process is actually one mechanism to hold these authors accountable for their research practices. So now I want to start with a little introductory story, which you may already know, but it can be illustrated by these few pictures. So the story is about a man and his son who get into a car accident. And so the man died on the way to the hospital, but the boy was rushed into surgery. And when they get to the hospital, the surgeon said, "I can operate, for that's my son." And so why does the surgeon make this statement? So I want you to take a few minutes to consider this and see what's the first answer that pops into your head. So here are some example answers that I've heard over the years, because I've told this story quite a few times, and I think it's very useful to illustrate the point I'm going to make. So some answers include that the son is probably adopted, so he has a biological father and an adoptive father. There are a few other explanations that people can find, and then after a while they think, oh, but could the surgeon actually be the mother? And so we can wonder why this answer, which actually when you think about parents, if the father is gone, statistically, the most likely answer should be that, of course, the other parent is the mother. And so why don't we get this likely answer immediately? And the reason is actually implicit bias, because the way the story is told, we're not necessarily looking for a parent, but we're looking for a surgeon. And so there is an association in a lot of people's mind that a surgeon is a man, and so the mother is not the immediate answer that we think about for this particular story. And so I want to now tell you a little bit more about implicit bias. So here's a definition of what it is. Bias that results from the tendency to process information based on unconscious associations and feelings, even when these are contrary to one's conscious or declared beliefs. And so in the case of that story, of course, we know that surgeon can be men or women, but in spite of that, we have the unconscious association and bias towards the idea that doctors and surgeons are men. And this doesn't only happen to other people. We are all subject to these kinds of biases. So as regards gender, but a lot more aspects of social situations and scientific situations as well. So when I introduced myself, I talked about my bias towards articles that are structured with the IMRAD structure. So for some reason, I just think that these types of articles are more clear. But so anyway, I also wanted to tell you about this project Implicit, which is conducted by a number of researchers at Harvard, and it's a research project that specifically investigates the social processes involved in social interactions, and try to understand implicit bias in this way. So they cover many aspects, including social attitudes and health, and they offer a set of implicit association tests, or IATs, that can be used to better understand biases and how we are subject to biases ourselves. And so, in fact, I would like to suggest as a little exercise in this tutorial that we all try to take a test from this implicit project. So you have the URL of the test right here. So based on the introductory story that I just showed you, I wanted to suggest that we do now the gender science test. So when you go to the website there, first you're going to see a disclaimer about taking the test and how it might change your perspectives and maybe your view on yourself and your beliefs. And then you're going to see a list of tests on the left side menu. And so gender science is going to be somewhere there, randomly positioned on the sidebar. And taking the test requires about 10 to 15 minutes. So first, you are going to be asked to fill some preliminary question forms, and then you actually take the test, which measures your reflex associations between words, IDs, and pictures by having you react and click on your keyboard when you see a number of words on the screen. And so we can, I guess, take a break here in the presentation. You can hit pause and take these 10-15 minutes to go and take the test. And then we'll come back together here to talk about the results and continue with the rest of this part of our tutorial on ethics and reviewing. Okay, so hopefully now you are back after taking the gender science test. And so I'm guessing that in addition to seeing your own result to the test, you were also shown this little graphic with the percent of web respondents who took this test, so between the period of January 2003 and December 2015. And we can see what the distribution is in terms of the automatic associations that people have between male and science and female and liberal arts. And so overall we can see that there are quite unbalanced associations of the preferences between genders and academic domains, where male is most frequently associated with science, while female is most frequently associated with liberal arts. And so that shows that in general, people, and so scientists also, are partial to this kind of biases. And that has an influence on our activities when we are in a position of evaluating or assessing papers and other types of work that is submitted to us. So we can wonder if we are aware of our biases, how can we handle them? And this is actually an open question. So some of the work from Project Implicit has actually explored this question. So one way can be to increase bias awareness, so using tests such as the one that you just took, as that can induce some guilt on the respondents and then motivate them to change their behavior, because you look at this test and you're like, oh my God, I'm so biased and I didn't realize maybe that was the case and I have to do something about it. However, another effect of the test, like when we see the distribution that I just showed you, so there can be the effect that realizing that the stereotype that one is partial to is actually prevalent, and that can create bias reinforcement. So seeing, okay, I'm biased, but everybody else is biased, and maybe I'm not as biased as some people who actually took that test, so why would I change my attitude? So it's really difficult to predict what is going to be a good way of actually handling and mitigating bias. So back to the specific context of reviewing, maybe one suggestion can be in certain situations to try and qualify comments where applicable. So as that means when you're reviewing a paper, perhaps framing your comments in a way that indicates where you're coming from when you're making the comments. So maybe as an expert on this particular topic, or as a non-expert on this particular topic, here's what your comments are. And so now I want to discuss a few types of biases that may affect reviewing. So there has been quite a lot of work recently on studying these biases and showing how much influence they have on reviewers. So gender is certainly a strong bias where so in general, male and older scientists and scientists from prestigious institutions and scientists who have already a very positive reputation in the community are evaluated in a more lenient and positive way than others. And so we come now to reviewing models which have been set into place as a balancing act, in fact, to try to mitigate the bias effect while trying to also still hold reviewers accountable for what they're saying. And so we're going to go through 3 different types of models that you probably already know about. So the first one is open reviews, where the identities of reviewers and paper authors are visible to all parties and are also visible as part of the publishing process once a paper is published. The single blind model is a model where the authors' names are known to the reviewers, but however the reviewers remain anonymous, so unknown to the authors. And depending on the cases, the name of reviewers may or may not be published after the paper has been accepted as part of a transparent review process. Then the double-blind model is a model where both authors and reviewers are unknown to each other. And so that is the model that we know in the ACL conferences. So there are pros and cons to each of these models. So with the open reviewing model, everyone is known to everyone else. So reviewers are, of course, accountable for the comments that they make. Another advantage is that there is no issues for authors to withhold any scientific content like links to code or to data sets to preserve their anonymity. However, in this model, all the biases that we have seen before are in full operations because you can absolutely infer from the author's name what their gender is, as well as institution that they are from, and whether they're a senior author or not, and so on. And in this model, one issue is that also reviewers may change their comments to be less critical in fear of future retaliation from the authors when they are themselves in the position of reviewing this person's work. So in the single blind model, this issue with reviewers' honesty or withholding criticism is solved because reviewers are not known to authors. Authors can still openly share all the scientific content that they wish, because there is no need to preserve anonymity for them. But however, we are still vulnerable to all the biases mentioned above, because once again, the authors are fully known to the reviewers. And finally, in the double-blind reviewing models, so the reviewers can be fully honest as before, because they are not known to the authors. Since the authors are not known to the reviewers, then the various biases that we have reviewed before hopefully are not subjecting the reviewers anymore. However, we can note that reviewers are possibly not accountable if they're not known to authors, and that was also the case in the single blind method, but we'll come back to that. And in this model, however, authors may have to withhold scientific content to preserve their anonymity. And so now I want to say a few more words about holding the reviewers accountable. So arguably, we can say that this is the area chair or the editor's role in the reviewing process, because even if authors and reviewers do not know each other, then there should always be an editor or chair who knows who is who and can make sure that conflicts of interests are avoided, and that the whole process is the whole editorial process is going as expected. Another way of holding reviewers accountable, but also giving credit where credit is due, is to absolutely declare secondary reviewers. So the ACL review forms have a specific field for that, and so it should absolutely be used when, as a reviewer, if you're collaborating with a secondary reviewer, or as a secondary reviewer when you're working on a paper, you should ask to be fully visible in this way. And so that also brings us to one very essential part of the editorial process, which is that feedback mechanisms are essential. So for reviewers to comment on the editorial review process, and also for authors to comment as well, and they should know, so each actor should know who to speak to provide feedback. And so we've talked about holding the reviewers accountable, but now let's see how we can also hold the authors accountable for their research, as I was saying at the beginning of this presentation. And so I think a lot of this has already been said by Karen in the actual review part. So for holding authors accountable, you should, as a reviewer, absolutely check for any issues with plagiarism, including self-plagiarism, checking for salami slicing, that is reporting very partial results to actually cut out a particular research project into too many papers. You should also check for the availability of reproducibility material when they are mentioned in the paper, and when there is no anonymity breach issue. So check that the material is available, check that code is available if it's offered, and whenever you can, check that code actually compiles and runs and does what's expected. And another important part is to check for ethical concerns, especially where data confidentiality is concerned. When corpus or research data is collected, for instance, and also any ethical concern in the research process itself. So that can, for instance, involve collecting informed consent from research subjects and so on. And so now that we have discussed quite a few things about the reviewing process, we just wanted to prompt here a little discussion about making the sausage, so to speak. So after being a reviewer, you can also be in the position of organizing a review process yourself if you're organizing a workshop or a conference. And so these are a few questions that you may want to ask yourself when you're in this position. So first, how are you going to define and handle conflicts of interest? And for instance, in the case of organizing a workshop or conference, are the organizers allowed to submit papers themselves? And if they do, how do you handle the review of those submissions? Who in your editorial committee should see the reviewer's name and when? How do you organize a discussion between reviewers if you want to do that? And which steps are you going to take to ensure that your reviewing process is transparent? If you have area chairs or organizers, probably their names should be mentioned somewhere, as well as the names of your reviewing committee, and also detail the reviewing process very clearly. Do you also want to organize a rebuttal period as well as a discussion period between authors and reviewers? How do you create and handle meta reviews? Do they get updated based on author's response? And so on. And there are no good answers, really, or unique answers, let's say, to these questions. And so as an illustration to that, here are some characteristics of various venues for publishing research in natural language processing. So there's been changes actually in the venues over the years, but here are here's a summary of some typical characteristics of these venues, depending on whether they choose to have an open or blind or double-blind review process. Do they allow supplements or appendix with the paper? Do they have area chairs or editors that are identified or not? Is there a response period, and so on? So just to show you that all processes are out there, and as an organizer of an event, it's also well, your decision to pick which one is going to work best for you. And so finally, we could be, I think, talking about this topic for hours, but we have to stop at some point. And here are some pointers for where to go for more information. So I wanted to mention a few quantitative studies of reviewing and scientific publication. So for instance, there were some studies that looked into the actual anonymity of the reviewing process and try to understand if authors could identify reviewers and reviewers could identify authors in double-blind review processes. There's also a number of work trying to understand and characterize bias in reviewing and their effects, and so that has been studied for reviewing papers, but also for reviewing grant proposals and a number of other scientific situations. And for tips on how to review, I think a lot of these have been already cited by Karen in her section about doing actual reviews, but the chairs blog from the ACL, Calling, and EMNLP chairs are offering a lot of very valuable information, and that's also why thinking about how to make the sausage is also an interesting perspective on thinking about the whole reviewing process and what works and what doesn't work. And so now we're coming to an end for this part of the reviewing tutorial about ethics and reviewing. So I just wanted to say it's been a bumpy ride to prepare the material for the tutorial, as well as the recording and everything, and trying to understand how to do this remotely when we were really looking forward to have an in-person event. So thank you for your attendance, for viewing this little video, and we would really like to have some feedback about the content, the way things are organized, any comments really that you may have